Welcome back to the Umbara Project. Today, we are looking at one of the darkest possible turning points in the final hours of the Clone Wars. What if Order 66 actually succeeded in killing Ahsoka Tano? Not years later, not during a duel with Darth Vader, and not in some distant corner of the rebellion, but right there aboard the Tribunal, only moments after the Republic she had fought to protect, transformed into the Galactic Empire. Ahsoka survived Order 66 in canon by the smallest possible margin. Rex fought against his inhibitor chip for just long enough to give her a clue. She understood that something had happened to the clones, traced Rex's warning back to Fives, removed his chip, and escaped the cruiser with him while Maul tore the ship apart from the inside. Change only one part of that sequence, however, and the consequences reach far beyond Ahsoka herself. They reshape the fate of Rex, Maul, the early rebellion, Kanan Jarrus, Ezra Bridger, Grand Admiral Thrawn, and eventually even the struggle that ends at Yavin. The key to making this scenario work is to keep the point of divergence small. We do not need Rex to hate Ahsoka. We do not need the 302nd Company to behave differently before Order 66. We do not need Palpatine to make a special plan for her. Everything can unfold exactly as it does in Shattered until the moment Rex receives the command. Ahsoka has just sensed something horrifying through the Force. She has felt Anakin's fall without understanding it, hearing fragments of the confrontation in the Chancellor's office as Mace Windu tries to arrest Darth Sidious. Then Rex turns on her. The clone captain, who had spent years fighting beside her, raises his pistols, tells her to find Fives, and begins firing. In canon, that brief hesitation saves her life. She cuts an escape route through the ceiling and disappears before the bridge can become her execution chamber. In this timeline, she is half a second slower. That is all it takes. Perhaps one of Rex's first bolts catches her in the shoulder as she tries to leap. Perhaps the shock breaks her concentration long enough for the surrounding clones to close their firing arcs. Perhaps Rex, still fighting the chip somewhere beneath the conditioning, hesitates once but not twice. Ahsoka is one of the most gifted survivors in the entire era, but Order 66 was designed around overwhelming even gifted Jedi, with a betrayal they could not emotionally process in time. Ki-Adi-Mundi, Plo Koon, Stas Ali, Aayla Secura, and countless others die because the soldiers beside them become executioners without warning. Ahsoka is not invincible simply because we know she survived in canon. If Rex's first burst lands cleanly, the bridge of the Tribunal becomes another Order 66 killing ground. For a moment, there would probably be no dramatic speech and no emotional reconciliation. That is part of what makes the scenario so brutal. Rex is not himself. The clones are not acting out of anger over Ahsoka leaving the Jedi Order or resentment from the war. Their inhibitor chips have overridden the relationships they built with her. The 302nd Company had literally painted their helmets in her markings before the siege of Mandalore. Many of these soldiers had volunteered to follow her, even though she was technically no longer a Jedi commander. Hours earlier, their armor was a tribute. Now those same helmets would be the last thing she sees. Ahsoka's death would also be bureaucratically simple. To the new Imperial command structure, she would be another target neutralized under Order 66. The legal technicality that she was no longer a member of the Jedi Order clearly did not protect her in canon, because Rex and the 302nd still interpreted the Order as applying to her. The Emperor had no reason to care about the distinction. Ahsoka had trained under Anakin Skywalker, fought as a Republic commander, associated with the Jedi Council, and had just captured Darth Maul. She was dangerous. Once she was dead, the clones could record the mission as complete and move on to their next instruction. The droids who help Ahsoka in canon would never become part of an escape plan. R7, A7, CH-33P, and GG would remain ordinary support units aboard the cruiser until the transition to Imperial authority, or until someone wiped their memories. No one would secretly open doors for Ahsoka. No one would manipulate elevators. No astromech would help isolate Rex in the medical bay. Most importantly, no one aboard the Tribunal would have both the knowledge and the motivation to investigate what had happened to the clone captain. Rex's warning about Fives would die with Ahsoka. That single lost clue is devastating, because Rex's resistance was not enough to save himself. In canon, he could force out only a few words. He could not remove his own chip, and once the order took hold, he became as relentless as the rest of the army. Ahsoka had to do the detective work. She accessed records concerning Fives, learned that the clone had claimed there was a conspiracy involving the inhibitor chips, physically captured Rex, and had the chip removed while clones were closing in around them. Without her, there is no rescue. Rex does not suddenly regain control because Ahsoka is dead. The conditioning remains active, and the version of Rex who walks away from that bridge is an Imperial soldier. The emotional horror is even worse when we remember that Rex was conscious enough to resist for an instant. Somewhere inside him, the man who respected Ahsoka knew what was happening. He knew Fives had been right about something. He knew he was about to kill someone he cared about. He still could not stop his own hands. If Ahsoka falls in front of him, there may be a buried fragment of Rex that understands exactly what he has done, but the chip does not allow that fragment to take control. The mission overrides the man. Once Ahsoka is confirmed dead, the entire sequence aboard the Tribunal changes. In canon, the ship becomes a battlefield because Ahsoka escapes, frees Maul as a diversion, rescues Rex, and then tries to reach a shuttle while the cruiser collapses around them. Here, there is no fugitive former Jedi moving through the decks, no clone captain switching sides, and no desperate attempt to avoid killing brainwashed soldiers. The crew simply carries out its standing orders. That means the Tribunal itself almost certainly remains intact. This is an important correction to the most obvious version of this what-if. It is tempting to imagine Maul still loose on a crashing Star Destroyer while Ahsoka is absent, but the crash is not an independent event. Maul causes it. Ahsoka releases him specifically because she needs chaos to pull clones away from Rex, and Maul proceeds to turn that chaos into catastrophe. He destroys troopers without a lightsaber, rips machinery apart with the Force, reaches the hyperdrive room, and tears the drive systems out of the cruiser. That is what drags the Tribunal toward the moon. If Ahsoka dies before she can release him, Maul remains sealed inside his Mandalorian containment device. No Maul in the corridors means no destroyed hyperdrive. No destroyed hyperdrive means no reason for the cruiser to plunge out of hyperspace toward a moon. The Tribunal continues on its route. That changes the atmosphere immediately. Instead of hundreds of clones dying in a crash, the 332nd survives. Instead of Rex and Ahsoka burying their brothers in a silent field of helmets, those soldiers remain available to the Empire. The unit that had been created to help Ahsoka liberate Mandalore becomes one of the first formations of the new regime. Their first Imperial accomplishment is killing the person whose markings they still wear. There is a bitter symbolism in that. The 302nd was one of the last visible reminders that the clone army had developed something like a culture of its own. The paint on their helmets represented loyalty chosen rather than programmed. It represented affection. It represented the years of shared experience that had made the clones more than identical soldiers. Order 66 proves how fragile that freedom always was. In canon, Ahsoka and Rex survive long enough to preserve the truth of that tragedy. In this timeline, the men who painted their faces for her never get the chance to understand why they murdered her. The Tribunal would then become a floating piece of evidence for the new Empire. Ahsoka's body would likely be secured, her lightsabers confiscated, and Maul kept under heavy guard. The officers aboard the ship would receive new directives as the Republic disappears almost overnight. The Senate is informed that the Jedi attempted to overthrow the Chancellor. Palpatine declares himself Emperor. The clone army becomes the military foundation of the Empire. In the middle of that transformation, the Tribunal arrives with two enormously significant prizes: proof that Anakin Skywalker's former apprentice is dead, and the captured former Sith Lord, who knows more about Darth Sidious than almost anyone still alive. And this is where Ahsoka's death begins to move beyond tragedy and into galactic consequence. Her survival in canon does not merely preserve one life. It creates a chain of people who remain free because she remained free. Rex lives because of her. Maul escapes because of her. The rebellion gains an intelligence operative because of her. The Ghost Crew gains a connection to a larger network because of her. Kanan and Ezra gain an ally capable of confronting Vader because of her. Remove Ahsoka at the first link in that chain, and the galaxy does not immediately collapse, but multiple futures disappear before anyone realizes they existed. The first of those futures belongs to Maul. In canon, Maul enters the final hours of the Clone Wars as a prisoner who understands the shape of Sidious's victory better than almost anyone else. He knows the war has been engineered. He knows the Republic is already dying. He knows Anakin Skywalker has been groomed for a role in Sidious's plan. He desperately tries to explain enough of this to Ahsoka that she might help him stop what is coming, but he is still Maul. His hatred, arrogance, and obsession make cooperation almost impossible. When Order 66 begins, Ahsoka releases him not because she trusts him, but because she needs a diversion. That act gives Maul his life. Without it, Maul has a very different problem. He is still trapped inside the containment device built to hold Force-sensitive prisoners, surrounded by clone troopers whose priorities have just changed from Republic orders to Imperial ones. Order 66 itself does not require the clones to kill Maul. He is not a Jedi. He is already a prisoner. The rational military response would be to continue transporting him to Coruscant until higher authority gives another command. That means the most likely immediate outcome is not that Maul dies aboard the Tribunal. It is that he reaches the Empire alive. For Darth Sidious, this is an uncomfortable gift. Maul is no longer merely a failed apprentice. He is a witness. He has seen Sidious operate in secret. He knows that Darth Tyrannus is Count Dooku. He understands that the Sith have been manipulating the Clone Wars from both sides. He knows that Anakin Skywalker was important enough to Sidious that Maul tried to lure Anakin to Mandalore specifically to deprive his former master of him. In the first hours of the Empire, almost all of this information is still politically explosive. Palpatine has won, but he has not yet spent decades rewriting history. A living Maul in Imperial custody is therefore both potentially useful and potentially dangerous. Sidious had spared Maul before, because Maul could lead him to Mother Talzin. By the end of the Clone Wars, that purpose is gone. Talzin is dead, Savage is dead, Dooku is dead, and Sidious has finally gained the apprentice he actually wanted in Darth Vader. Maul is no longer necessary to complete that chain. In fact, leaving him alive creates risk. The simplest outcome is that Maul never leaves Imperial custody. He could be transferred to a secure prison, interrogated for information about the surviving criminal syndicates and Mandalorian contacts, and then executed once Sidious is satisfied that nothing more can be extracted from him. There is still a chance Maul escapes. He is one of the most resourceful survivors in the saga, and being brought into a prison complex creates opportunities that a sealed containment pod does not. He could manipulate guards, exploit a transfer, call on hidden loyalists, or wait for the chaos of the Republic to Empire transition. But he would be attempting that escape under far worse conditions than canon. In canon, Ahsoka opens his cage and the clones are distracted by hunting her and Rex, while the entire cruiser is falling apart. Here, every security system is functioning, every clone aboard the Tribunal is still loyal to the chain of command, and the new Emperor has a personal reason to make sure Maul never speaks freely. So the cleanest version of this timeline is that Maul's post-war criminal empire either never emerges in the same form, or is severed from him almost immediately. The organization later associated with Crimson Dawn can still exist in some form, because Maul's underworld connections were broader than a single escape. Dryden Voss and other criminal figures do not vanish just because Maul is captured, but Maul himself is no longer in a position to rebuild his influence from the shadows. One of the Empire's most unpredictable enemies is removed before the Imperial Age properly begins. That matters for more than crime. Maul's survival in canon shapes Ezra Bridger, Kanan Jarrus, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the search for knowledge about the Sith. On Malachor, Maul manipulates Ezra into helping him access the Sith Temple. He blinds Kanan. He later hunts Obi-Wan to Tatooine, and dies only after finally discovering that Kenobi is protecting someone he believes to be the Chosen One. If Maul dies in Imperial custody years earlier, all of that disappears. Ezra loses one of the most dangerous dark-side influences he ever encounters. Kanan never receives the injury that changes the way he connects to the Force. Obi-Wan never has that final confrontation with his old enemy. Even before we reach the rebellion, the death of Ahsoka has already erased several of the relationships that define the next generation. But the most immediate consequence is not Maul. It is Anakin Skywalker, or more accurately, the man who is becoming Darth Vader at almost the exact same time Ahsoka dies. Anakin does not know what is happening aboard the Tribunal when he kneels before Palpatine in the Chancellor's office. He does not know that Rex has raised a blaster at Ahsoka. He does not know that the men who once fought beside him have just murdered the Padawan he trained. His world has narrowed to Padme, Sidious, and the terrible choice he has already made. By the time he marches into the Jedi Temple as Darth Vader, he has accepted the lie that destroying the Order is necessary to gain the power to save his wife. Ahsoka's death, therefore, does not prevent his initial fall. The tragedy is that it removes one of the few emotional threads that could ever pull against that fall afterward. It is important not to overstate what Ahsoka's survival did for Vader in canon. She did not secretly keep him good during the first years of the Empire, and she was not present when Luke finally reached him aboard the second Death Star. Vader spends years believing Ahsoka is dead. When he discovers through the Force that she survived, it does not immediately soften him. Their reunion on Malachor becomes a violent confrontation. He tells her that Anakin Skywalker was weak and that he destroyed him. Yet the scene matters precisely because Ahsoka is living evidence that Anakin existed. She remembers him as a teacher, a brother, a hero, and a deeply flawed man. Vader can reject that identity, but he cannot erase it while she stands in front of him. In this timeline, there is no such confrontation waiting years in the future. Palpatine can allow Vader to believe that everyone tied to Anakin is gone. Padme dies. The Jedi Order is destroyed. Obi-Wan disappears. Ahsoka is confirmed killed by clones during the Purge. Rex remains loyal to the Empire. The 501st becomes synonymous with the assault on the Jedi Temple, rather than with the complicated bonds it once formed during the war. Every part of Anakin's old life can be reframed as something that ended because the Jedi were doomed, treacherous, or weak. Would Vader learn exactly how Ahsoka died? Very likely, eventually, although perhaps not immediately. The Tribunal would possess mission logs, helmet recordings, bridge security footage, and after-action reports. Rex himself would be an obvious witness. Palpatine might choose to suppress the information at first, particularly while Anakin is emotionally unstable and focused on Padme. But once Vader is sealed into his armor and the Emperor is consolidating control over him, Ahsoka's death becomes useful material. Sidious has always understood how to turn loss into dependency. He does not have to tell Vader, "I ordered your troops to murder her." He only has to shape the story. Ahsoka, he can say, chose the Jedi path in the end. She captured Maul on behalf of the Council. She was caught in the same rebellion as the rest of them. The clones carried out their duty. Her death proves that attachment brings pain. Her death proves that Anakin's former life had nothing left to offer him. Her death proves that the only person who did not abandon him was his new master. That interpretation is grotesque, but it is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation Sidious has used for years. Anakin's greatest vulnerability has never simply been anger. It is fear of loss, combined with the belief that he must personally control that loss. His mother dies after he fails to reach her in time. Ahsoka leaves the Jedi Order after he cannot convince her to stay. Padme becomes the focus of his desperate attempt to prevent another death. If he then learns that Ahsoka was executed while he was becoming Vader, he has another unbearable loss to process, and Sidious is the only authority left telling him what that loss means. There is also a darker possibility. Vader might realize that the order came from Palpatine. He is not stupid, and after Mustafar, he knows exactly who created the Empire. If he reads a report showing that Rex received a direct emergency command under Order 66, there is no reason he could not understand that Sidious was responsible for the mechanism that killed Ahsoka. Would that make him rebel against his master? Probably not, at least not early. Vader in the Imperial era is already filled with hatred for Sidious. Their Sith relationship is not based on affection. It is based on domination, usefulness, fear, resentment, and the pursuit of power. Learning that Sidious caused Ahsoka's death could deepen that hatred without giving Vader the strength or emotional clarity to act on it. In fact, it might make his imprisonment worse. Vader could blame Sidious, the Jedi, the clones, himself, and Ahsoka all at once. He could tell himself that if Ahsoka had remained with the Order, she betrayed him. Then tell himself that if she had stayed with him personally, she might have lived. Then remember that he was absent because he had chosen to save Palpatine. Then bury that contradiction beneath violence. This is how Vader survives psychologically. He turns grief into rage, because rage is easier than admitting that his own choices destroyed the people he loved. Ahsoka's survival in canon eventually creates a moment in which that denial is challenged by someone who knew him before the mask. When she damages Vader's helmet on Malachor and sees Anakin's eye beneath it, she refuses to leave him again. That line reaches directly into the abandonment wound that defined both of them. Vader still attacks her, but the encounter forces Anakin's past into the room. Without Ahsoka, that moment simply never happens. The next person with the emotional legitimacy to reach Anakin is Luke, almost 2 decades later. That makes Vader's path to Luke colder. It does not mean Luke can no longer redeem him. Luke's role is unique. Luke is Anakin's son, the living proof that Padme's children survived, and the person whose compassion finally gives Vader a choice he believed had disappeared forever. But a Vader who has spent nearly 20 years without even the shock of discovering Ahsoka alive may be more psychologically sealed inside the identity Sidious built for him. He has had fewer reminders that Anakin's relationship survived the Purge. He has had fewer confrontations with someone who refuses to see the mask as the whole man. There is another factor that makes this version of Vader more dangerous much earlier. Ahsoka's death eliminates the emotional disturbance he experiences when he senses her with the rebels. In canon, Vader discovers her presence after attacking Phoenix Squadron. Through the Force, he realizes that his former apprentice lives. The discovery is startling even to him. From that point forward, Ahsoka becomes both a target and a personal obsession. He wants information. He wants to understand what she knows. He wants to confront the past. That attention is dangerous for the rebels, but it also divides Vader's motivations. Some of his actions are no longer purely strategic. In this timeline, Phoenix Squadron has no Ahsoka for Vader to sense. If Vader attacks them at all, he sees only targets. There is no moment of recognition, no hidden emotional shock, no reason to preserve a pathway toward a personal confrontation on Malachor. He can approach the rebel network with the same brutal efficiency he uses against any other insurgency. And while Vader becomes more isolated, Rex moves in the opposite direction from his canon path. Canon Rex becomes one of the most important pieces of evidence that the clones were victims as well as perpetrators. Once Ahsoka removes his inhibitor chip, he immediately understands that his brothers are being controlled. He cannot save the 302nd, but he survives with the truth. In the years that follow, he helps other clones, eventually reconnects with Gregor and Wolf, and later joins the rebellion after the Ghost Crew finds him on Selos. None of that begins here. Rex leaves the Tribunal with his chip still inside his head, and with Ahsoka's death recorded as a successful military action. What happens to him after the initial effect of Order 66 fades is one of the most psychologically interesting parts of this scenario. The chips do not appear to turn every clone into a permanently mindless automaton. Their strongest purpose is ensuring compliance with the Order and suppressing resistance at the crucial moment. Afterward, clones can display personality, doubt, and even disillusionment again. We see in the early Imperial era that some clones remain fiercely loyal, some become uncomfortable with the new regime, some desert, and some rebel outright. Rex therefore would not necessarily remain a blank, brainwashed machine forever. The horror is that by the time his independent thought begins returning, Ahsoka is already dead. Imagine Rex weeks after Order 66. The adrenaline is gone. The Republic uniforms are changing. Officers are using the word Empire. Jedi who once commanded clone units are now described as traitors. The 382nd still wears Ahsoka's facial markings because no one has yet ordered them repainted. Rex remembers standing on the bridge. He remembers the words he forced out about fives. He remembers firing. At that point, his mind has to find a way to live with what happened. He could accept Imperial propaganda because the alternative is unbearable. Perhaps the Jedi really did betray the Chancellor. Perhaps Ahsoka was part of it. Perhaps his hesitation was simply confusion. That is the comfortable version. The painful version is that Fives was right, that Rex knew he was right for a fraction of a second, and that someone placed a device in his head that used his body to murder one of his closest friends. Canon Rex eventually chooses the painful truth. This Rex has fewer tools to reach it. Ahsoka is not there to show him the medical evidence. The records surrounding Fives are likely classified or destroyed. Tup's malfunction has already been covered up. Kamino is rapidly being subordinated to Imperial authority. Palpatine has every reason to bury any documentation suggesting that the army was engineered to murder the Jedi. Even if Rex starts asking questions, he is asking them inside the institution responsible for the conspiracy. His status also works against him. Rex is not an anonymous trooper who can disappear easily. He is one of the most decorated and experienced officers in the Grand Army. He served directly under Anakin Skywalker. He fought on Christophsis, Geonosis, Umbara, Onderon, and Mandalore. Imperial commanders have every reason to retain him during the transition period, especially while the Empire is still relying heavily on clone forces. A soldier like Rex could become exactly the kind of field officer used to pacify worlds that refuse to accept the new order. This does not mean Rex becomes a willing monster. That would misunderstand his character. Rex has always valued the lives of his men, questioned bad leadership, and struggled when orders conflict with conscience. The Umbara campaign proves that he can eventually resist a superior when the evidence becomes overwhelming. But Order 66 is different because it hijacks the mechanism by which he makes that choice. In the immediate aftermath, he has already crossed a line he never would have crossed freely. The Empire could exploit that guilt. Give Rex another mission before he has time to process the last one. Send him after a Jedi survivor, tell him that the target is dangerous, place him beside clones whose chips are still reinforcing the same assumptions. Each successful operation makes it harder to admit that the first one was a crime. By the time doubts become strong enough to matter, Rex may have spent months helping build the regime he would eventually hate. There is a plausible path where Rex becomes an early Imperial enforcer. Not an Inquisitor, obviously, and not a replacement for Vader, but a highly trusted clone officer attached to campaigns against separatist holdouts, insurgents, and suspected Jedi sympathizers. The 501st and other veteran units are among the best soldiers available to the new Empire. Rex's tactical experience would be valuable during the period when stormtroopers are still being introduced and clone formations remain operational. If a surviving Jedi appears on a world Rex is assigned to pacify, his history makes him especially dangerous. He knows Jedi tactics. He understands how they move, how they use terrain, how they coordinate with clones, and how they protect civilians. During the Clone Wars, that knowledge made him an exceptional ally. During the Purge, it could make him an exceptional hunter. The thought of Rex using lessons learned from Anakin and Ahsoka to corner other survivors is one of the cruelest consequences of this timeline. Yet that career has an expiration date. The Empire does not intend to remain a clone state. The rapid aging built into the clone army means veterans physically deteriorate far faster than ordinary humans. At the same time, the Imperial military moves toward recruited and conscripted stormtroopers. Clone individuality becomes inconvenient to an institution that values scale and obedience. Even an officer as accomplished as Rex eventually becomes a relic. In canon, Rex escapes that process and builds a life outside the Empire. In this timeline, he could instead spend his best remaining years serving it and then discover that loyalty buys him very little. Perhaps he is retired when his body begins showing its age. Perhaps he is reassigned as a training officer, teaching the first generations of stormtroopers how to fight. Gregor canonically performs exactly that kind of work before deserting. Rex could plausibly end up in a similar role, watching ordinary recruits replace the brothers who were bred for war. There is also a chance that Rex eventually removes his chip on his own. Doubt does not vanish forever, and other clones learn the truth in different ways. If Rex encounters evidence of the conspiracy years later, he may finally undergo the procedure Ahsoka once performed for him. But even that does not restore the canon timeline. A free Rex who wakes up months or years after Ahsoka's death is a completely different man from the Rex who escaped the tribunal beside her. He carries direct responsibility, however involuntary, for her death. He has no Ahsoka to tell him that the clones were manipulated. He has no shared survival experience to anchor him. That Rex might rebel, but his rebellion would be fueled by guilt rather than rescue. He could search for Wolf and Gregor. He could help clone deserters. He could even become a useful ally to Bail Organa's network. But he is much less likely to become the relatively stable retired captain we meet on Selos. The quiet life of hunting Jupa with old brothers only exists because Rex escaped the birth of the Empire early enough to preserve some distance from what followed. And the Selos connection matters enormously. In Star Wars Rebels, Ahsoka directs the Ghost Crew toward Rex because the rebellion needs information about potential bases. Rex then chooses to help them, and his return to the fight becomes a bridge between the Clone Wars generation and the new rebel movement. Without Ahsoka, the Ghost Crew has no reason to receive that specific lead. Without a free Rex, there may be no lead to receive anyway. Wolf and Gregor could still survive, but the trio that becomes a living memory of the clone army is broken before it forms. That loss is not merely sentimental. Rex later contributes military experience to the rebellion. He understands Imperial doctrine because he helped create the doctrine the Empire inherited. He has fought beside Jedi, droids, insurgents, and conventional armies across dozens of worlds. Removing him deprives the rebels of a veteran whose entire life has been training for galactic war. So by the time the Empire stabilizes, Ahsoka's death has already achieved 3 things for Palpatine, without him needing to plan any of them. Maul is likely neutralized in Imperial custody. Rex is either serving the Empire or struggling alone with the consequences of the chip. Vader has lost one more connection to Anakin Skywalker. None of these outcomes wins the Galactic Civil War by itself, but all 3 make the new regime cleaner, quieter, and more secure. The next consequence is less immediate, because Ahsoka does not become Fulcrum the day after Order 66. She first disappears. She hides. She attempts to live as an ordinary person. Only later, after being forced to confront the Empire again, and reconnecting with Bail Organa, does she choose to become an intelligence operative. That distinction matters because the rebellion does not exist solely because Ahsoka survives. Bail Organa and Mon Mothma are already resisting Palpatine politically before the Republic falls, and Bail begins building covert resistance afterward. Ahsoka is not the single founder of the Rebel Alliance, but she becomes one of the people who makes a scattered resistance network actually function. That difference between founder and connective tissue is the key to understanding the early rebellion without Ahsoka. If she dies aboard the Tribunal, Bail Organa does not suddenly decide that resistance is impossible. He has already watched Palpatine accumulate emergency powers throughout the Clone Wars. He has worked with Padme Amidala and Mon Mothma to push back against the militarization of the Republic. He witnesses the aftermath of the attack on the Jedi Temple, and understands that the official story does not explain what he saw. After the Empire is declared, Bail still has every reason to build a secret opposition. Alderaan still has resources. Mon Mothma still has political credibility. Senatorial networks still exist. Saw Gerrera and other militant resistance movements still have their own reasons to fight. What disappears is one of the rare people capable of moving between those worlds without belonging completely to any of them. Ahsoka is no longer a Jedi, which helps her operate without the baggage of trying to restore the old order. She is a veteran commander, which gives her military judgment. She understands clone and republic systems, has personal connections across the galaxy, and can defend herself against threats that would destroy ordinary agents. Most importantly, she knows how to earn trust from people who are suspicious of institutions. That is exactly the skill a rebellion made of isolated cells requires. When she eventually takes the codename Fulcrum, she becomes an intelligence operative whose identity is hidden, even from many of the rebels receiving her information. The value of that role is not that every rebel cell takes direct orders from Ahsoka. The value is compartmentalization. A cell can receive coordinates, supplies, or intelligence without knowing the entire network. If one group is captured, it cannot expose everyone else. Bail can support resistance while maintaining plausible deniability in the Senate. Different groups can remain operational without gathering in one place, where the Empire can destroy them all at once. Without Ahsoka, Bail would have to find other agents to perform parts of that work. He almost certainly would. A galactic rebellion cannot depend on one operative forever. But replacements do not duplicate relationships. Another intelligence officer might be excellent at logistics and still have no reason to trust a former clone captain on Selos. Another courier might know Hera Syndulla and still be unable to sense a Sith Lord through the Force. Another spy might connect cells, but be incapable of surviving direct contact with Imperial Inquisitors. Ahsoka's absence creates dozens of small gaps, and the Empire only needs a few of those gaps to become fatal. The Ghost Crew is the perfect example. Hera Syndulla does not begin resisting the Empire because Ahsoka tells her to. Her opposition grows from her own experiences, her family history on Ryloth, and her decision to fight Imperial oppression. Kanan Jarrus survives Order 66 independently as Caleb Doom and spends years hiding before becoming part of Hera's crew. Sabine Wren, Zeb Aurelios, and Chopper have their own paths into that family. Ezra Bridger grows up on Lothal regardless of whether Ahsoka lives. His parents still oppose Imperial rule, and he still becomes an orphan, surviving on the streets. The Ghost can therefore still exist. That is important because a weaker what-if would simply erase every character Ahsoka later meets. Canon does not work that way. Hera is capable enough to build a cell without her. Kanan can train Ezra without her. The crew can steal supplies, sabotage Imperial operations, and inspire people on Lothal without knowing that Ahsoka Tano ever survived the Clone Wars. In fact, much of the first season of Rebels proves exactly that. The Ghost crew spends most of that year fighting locally, while Fulcrum remains a mysterious contact, rather than a visible member of the team. The difference appears when local resistance begins becoming galactic resistance. In canon, the Ghost crew gradually discovers that they are not alone. Hera has been connected to a larger movement, and the end of their first season reveals that organized rebel forces are operating beyond Lothal. Ahsoka steps out of the shadows as one of the figures linking those cells. From that moment, the crew stops being merely a successful band of insurgents and becomes part of something that can eventually resemble an alliance. Without Ahsoka, that transition can still happen, but it becomes less smooth and potentially much more dangerous. Bail and other organizers must decide whether to reveal more of themselves directly. Hera may receive intelligence from another Fulcrum agent, because Fulcrum becomes a codename used by others as well. But that operative will have a different history and different instincts. The network may be more cautious about Kanan and Ezra, because two Jedi attract Imperial attention, on a scale ordinary rebels do not. That concern is justified. The Grand Inquisitor is already hunting Kanan and Ezra before Ahsoka openly joins them. His pursuit does not depend on her existence. He is tasked by Vader with finding surviving Jedi and Force-sensitive children. Kanan repeatedly escapes him, and by the end of the first season, Kanan and Ezra defeat him aboard the Sovereign over Mustafar. The Grand Inquisitor chooses death rather than face Vader after failure. Ahsoka is not present in that duel. Therefore, killing Ahsoka during Order 66 does not automatically save the Grand Inquisitor, or cause Kanan and Ezra to die in Season 1. That is where the timeline needs to be precise. The real breaking point comes after the Grand Inquisitor's death, when Vader personally becomes involved. Vader is vastly beyond the threat Kanan and Ezra have faced up to that point. When he encounters them on Lothal, he overwhelms both. Their survival is not proof that they can match him. It is proof that the Ghost crew is very good at escaping impossible situations. Vader later attacks the larger rebel fleet, and nearly annihilates Phoenix Squadron by himself. Canon already shows how vulnerable this network is when the Emperor's strongest enforcer gives it his full attention. Ahsoka changes the equation in two ways. First, she is another Force user powerful enough to matter. She cannot defeat Vader cleanly, but she can survive encounters that would be hopeless for Kanan or Ezra. Second, Vader's discovery that she is alive changes his relationship to the hunt. He has a personal reason to pursue the rebels and a personal mystery to resolve. That is dangerous, but it also means Ahsoka can deliberately position herself between Vader and younger people, who have no chance against him. In the timeline where she died, there is no protective layer. When Phoenix Squadron is exposed, the rebels have Kanan and Ezra, but they do not have a former apprentice of Anakin Skywalker standing beside them. If Vader attacks with the same aggression he shows in canon, there is no Force connection that stuns him with recognition, and no powerful former Jedi capable of taking responsibility for confronting him later. The likely result is not that Vader kills the entire Ghost crew in their first meeting. Hera, Sabine, Zeb, and Chopper are extremely difficult targets, and Kanan has spent years surviving by knowing when to run. But the margin for error becomes much smaller. Every time Kanan or Ezra engages an Inquisitor, there is no Ahsoka to advise them. Every time the rebels plan a mission involving Sith activity, there is no one in the network with Ahsoka's understanding of Anakin, the Jedi Order, and the dark side threat now controlling the Empire. The loss of Rex deepens that vulnerability. In canon, Ahsoka sends the Ghost crew to Selos, where they recruit Rex's help. Kanan initially distrusts the clones because of what happened during Order 66, but Rex gradually earns his respect. That relationship gives Kanan a chance to confront trauma he has carried since childhood. It also gives the rebellion an experienced commander who eventually returns to active service. In this timeline, the mission to Silos probably never occurs. Even if Wolf and Gregor somehow end up there, Ahsoka does not know where to send the ghost. If Rex remains Imperial, the very idea of seeking him out could become a trap. Imagine an especially dark version of that encounter. Hera receives information about a former clone officer who may know Old Republic military routes. The ghost travels to investigate, only to discover Captain Rex wearing Imperial insignia. Kanan sees the face of the army that murdered his master. Rex sees a Jedi survivor and feels the inhibitor programming. Imperial conditioning or years of guilt collide inside him. Instead of the reconciliation we know, the meeting becomes a firefight. Even if Rex hesitates and eventually lets them escape, the trust that Kanan built between generations never forms. Without Rex, the rebels also lose access to his memories of bases, tactics, and personnel. That might sound small compared with lightsaber battles, but rebellions survive on information. A hidden hyperspace route can matter more than a fleet. Knowledge of an abandoned installation can give a cell somewhere to refuel. Understanding how clone-era military logistics evolved into Imperial doctrine can reveal predictable weaknesses. Rex is a walking archive of the war that created the Empire. Ahsoka's death locks much of that archive on the wrong side. Then there is the question of Maul and Malachor. If Maul is executed or permanently imprisoned by the Empire after being delivered aboard the intact tribunal, the entire Malachor sequence changes even before Ahsoka's absence is considered. Ezra may still be drawn toward knowledge of the Sith. Kanan may still search for ways to defeat the Inquisitors. The ancient temple still exists, but Maul is not there to guide Ezra through it, manipulate his frustration, or help open the Sith holocron. That could actually make Ezra safer in one respect. Maul is a corrosive influence. He recognizes Ezra's anger and loneliness and tries to turn them into leverage. Without him, Ezra loses a teacher who pushes him toward using the dark side. Kanan also avoids being blinded by Maul during the confrontation. A fully sighted Kanan, with a less dark side influenced Ezra, sounds like an improvement for the rebellion. But Malachor is not simply a story about Maul making things worse. It is also where several powerful enemies collide, and where the rebels gain knowledge about the scale of the Sith threat. Remove Ahsoka and Maul simultaneously, and Kanan and Ezra may never have the same reason to go there at all. If they do, they face the Inquisitors without the temporary alliance that helps them survive. The fifth brother, seventh sister, and eighth brother are not unbeatable individually, but together they put enormous pressure on the Jedi. Kanan and Ezra survive Canon Malachor partly because the battlefield is chaotic and because Ahsoka and Maul are both present. A two-person expedition could become a fatal mistake. Kanan is skilled but not yet a match for Vader. Ezra is still learning. If the Inquisitors corner them before they can escape, one or both could be captured. If Vader arrives afterward, their chances collapse further. Ahsoka's canon decision to face Vader alone is what creates the opening for Kanan and Ezra to leave Malachor. Without her, there is no one who can hold him there. Even if Malachor never happens, Vader remains the long-term problem. The Ghost Crew is becoming more visible. Ezra's broadcasts inspire resistance on Lothal. Kanan is an openly active Jedi. Hera is connecting with larger rebel formations. The Empire eventually has enough information to send more than local officers after them. Once Vader personally decides that Kanan and Ezra must die, the rebels need either an extraordinary escape or an extraordinary distraction. Canon repeatedly gives them both. This timeline has removed several of the people capable of creating those distractions. So the most plausible outcome is not a precise date on which Vader kills Ezra. It is a steadily increasing probability that the Jedi pair does not survive long enough to reach the final year of the Lothal campaign. Perhaps Kanan is killed protecting Ezra during a Vader attack. Perhaps Ezra is captured by the Inquisitorius. Perhaps Hera recognizes that keeping Jedi aboard the Ghost is putting every connected cell at risk and forces the group to split. Any of those outcomes prevents the exact chain that Kanan requires for Lothal's liberation. Ezra is particularly important because his significance grows far beyond his combat ability. Early Ezra is not a galactic strategist. He is impulsive, emotional, and still learning what it means to fight for people other than himself. Over time, however, he develops an unusual relationship with the living force. He connects with creatures in ways many Jedi do not. He communes with the Loth Wolves. He learns from Yoda. He encounters the Bendu. He discovers pathways and possibilities that conventional military thinkers cannot predict. Ahsoka is not solely responsible for that development. Kanan is Ezra's master. Hera gives him a family. The experiences of Lothal shape him more than any one mentor. It would therefore be inaccurate to say that without Ahsoka, Ezra simply never becomes powerful. He might still grow tremendously. What Ahsoka's death does is make the environment around that growth much more hostile and remove specific encounters that help keep his path connected to the wider history of the Jedi. The world between worlds illustrates this perfectly. Ahsoka does not teach Ezra how to enter it. The portal is tied to the Jedi Temple on Lothal, and Ezra reaches that realm through his own connection to the temple and the Loth Wolves. Once inside, however, one of the defining things he does is reach through a portal and pull Ahsoka out of her duel with Vader on Malachor. That act creates a strange closed loop. Ahsoka survived Order 66, later fought Vader, and then survived that duel because Ezra eventually rescued her from a realm outside ordinary time. If Ahsoka died during Order 66, that portal to Malachor contains no living Ahsoka to rescue. Ezra could theoretically still discover the world between worlds if every other part of his journey remains intact, but the experience would be fundamentally different. He would hear different echoes. He would not make the same choice to save Ahsoka. He would not have her there to warn him against using the realm to rewrite personal loss. Palpatine could still attempt to access the place through Ezra, and that becomes potentially even more dangerous. Canon Ahsoka acts as a stabilizing presence inside the world between worlds. When Ezra becomes tempted by the possibility of saving Kanan, she helps him understand that pulling Kanan out of the moment of his sacrifice could also undo the salvation of everyone Kanan died protecting. That lesson is central to Ezra accepting loss rather than using cosmic power to possess the past. Remove Ahsoka from the room, and Ezra has to reach that understanding alone, while Palpatine is actively trying to reach through the portal. If Kanan has already died earlier in this timeline, an isolated Ezra entering the world between worlds could be more emotionally vulnerable than ever. Palpatine does not need to physically enter the realm immediately. He needs Ezra to make a mistake. Promise him his parents, promise him Kanan, promise him a version of Lothal where no one suffers. Ezra's strength in canon is that he eventually refuses to use the Force to control what he cannot bear to lose, the exact lesson Anakin failed to learn. Without Ahsoka present during that cosmic test, the danger that Ezra repeats Anakin's mistake increases. There is another possibility, and it is simpler. Ezra never reaches the temple at all. If Vader, the Inquisitors, or Imperial pressure fracture the Ghost Crew earlier, the Lothal campaign may never advance to the point where the rebels can investigate the temple under occupation. The Empire could seize it more completely. Palpatine's own archaeological and dark side interests might eventually uncover its secrets without Ezra acting as the necessary key. In that case, Ahsoka's death has indirectly removed not only a rebel hero, but one of the people who denied Sidious access to a power outside normal space and time. That is the pattern we keep seeing. Ahsoka is rarely the only person who can accomplish a task. Star Wars is too interconnected for that. But she repeatedly stands at junctions where several people, organizations, and eras meet. Remove her, and other characters continue moving until they reach those junctions, with nobody waiting on the other side. Hera still becomes a leader. Bail still funds resistance. Kanan still wants to train Ezra. Ezra still wants to free Lothal. But the lines between them are thinner, and every Imperial victory has a better chance of isolating oneself from another. That becomes especially important when Grand Admiral Thrawn enters the conflict. Thrawn is dangerous in canon because he does not treat the rebellion as a collection of random criminals. He studies it. He looks for patterns in culture, tactics, art, and behavior. He understands that destroying one cell is less important than identifying the structure connecting multiple cells. That makes him exactly the kind of Imperial commander who benefits from Ahsoka's absence. A fragmented rebellion is harder to detect in one sense, because there is less centralized communication to intercept. But once Thrawn identifies a cell, Fragmentation also means there are fewer allies capable of warning, reinforcing, or extracting it. The Grand Admiral's arrival on Lothal does not depend on Ahsoka. He is brought in because the rebel threat has become serious, and because local Imperial leadership has repeatedly failed. If Hera's cell continues to grow, despite the harsher conditions of this timeline, Thrawn can still be assigned to destroy it. The difference is that he may be facing a weaker coalition. Rex may not be present. Ahsoka is certainly absent. Maul is probably gone. Phoenix Squadron may have suffered even heavier losses under Vader. The rebel leadership has fewer experienced people who understand both Republic-era warfare and the personal habits of the Empire's most dangerous servants. Thrawn would notice that weakness quickly. He is not interested in theatrical terror for its own sake. He applies pressure where it produces information. If the rebel cells are more isolated, he can target supply chains and force them to choose between abandoning local populations and revealing hidden connections. He can allow a shipment to escape because tracking it tells him where the next base is. He can use captured agents to map the network. He can study Hera's decisions until he knows which risks she is willing to take for her people. Hera remains a formidable opponent. Ahsoka's death does not make her less intelligent, and Thrawn's canonical campaign against Phoenix Squadron is not a simple sequence of Imperial victories. The rebels repeatedly surprise him, escape him, and exploit political complications within the Empire. But the point of this timeline is accumulation. Hera is fighting the same Grand Admiral with fewer pieces on the board. Kanan is one of those pieces. If he survives into the period of Thrawn's campaign, he may actually be physically stronger than his canon counterpart, because Maul never blinds him on Malachor. Yet that apparent advantage changes his spiritual development. Canon Kanan's blindness forces him to stop relying on sight and confront his fear in a new way. His relationship with the Force deepens. By the time of his final sacrifice on Lothal, he has grown into a remarkably centered Jedi, capable of accepting exactly what he must do to save Hera and the others. Without Maul, Kanan may avoid the injury, but he also avoids the path of growth that follows it. That does not mean he becomes a worse Jedi. Growth can happen through different experiences. It simply means the Kanan facing Thrawn is not identical to the man we know. He may be more aggressive in combat, less inwardly transformed, and more willing to rely on his physical abilities. Against ordinary Imperials, that could help. Against Thrawn, predictable confidence can be exploited. Ezra's path becomes even more uncertain. Canon Ezra eventually understands that defeating Thrawn requires something the Grand Admiral cannot reduce to conventional strategy. He uses his connection with the Purrgil, the enormous hyperspace-traveling creatures he had encountered earlier, and brings them into the final battle over Lothal. When the Purrgil seize the Chimera and carry both Thrawn and Ezra away, the Empire loses the commander capable of retaking the planet at the exact moment the local occupation collapses. Ahsoka does not teach Ezra to call the Purrgil. That needs to be clear. Ezra's bond with them begins independently. If he survives all the same experiences, he could still conceive the plan even in a galaxy where Ahsoka died. So the question is not whether Ahsoka's absence magically removes the Purrgil. The question is whether the chain of reduced support, increased Imperial pressure, a missing Rex, a different Malachor, and a more focused Vader prevents Ezra from reaching the emotional and strategic maturity required to use that connection at the decisive moment. There are many places that chain can break. Ezra could die before Thrawn arrives. Kanan could be captured, leaving Ezra without a master. The Ghost Crew could be separated from the larger rebel network after a devastating Imperial strike. Hera could be forced to abandon Lothal because the cell no longer has enough support to challenge a sector-wide occupation. Any of those outcomes means there is no final plan built around surrendering to Thrawn and turning the Purrgil into the unexpected force that removes him. If Thrawn remains in the known galaxy after the liberation attempt, Lothal is probably not liberated at all. The rebels' canon victory depends on a remarkable combination of factors: local resistance, Ezra's connection with the planet, the destruction of Imperial facilities, the removal of Thrawn's fleet, and the fact that the Empire becomes distracted by larger events before it can immediately retake the world. Leave Thrawn and the Chimera in place, and the final battle ends differently. Thrawn does not need to destroy Lothal out of spite. He needs to make rebellion strategically impossible. He can bombard selected targets, capture leadership, restore the blockade, and rebuild enough infrastructure to keep the planet under control. Ezra's friends are not likely to receive the breathing room canon gives them. Ryder Azadi, Sabine, Zeb, Hera, and the other defenders become fugitives or prisoners. Lothal remains an Imperial world. More importantly, Thrawn remains available to the Emperor during the final years before the Battle of Yavin. This is where the timeline begins to affect the original trilogy era in a serious way. In canon, Thrawn disappears with Ezra before the destruction of the first Death Star. The Imperial military therefore enters the Yavin crisis without him. Grand Moff Tarkin commands the battle station. Vader hunts the stolen plans. Other admirals and generals respond according to the Empire's established doctrine, which is powerful but often arrogant. Keeping Thrawn in Imperial service does not automatically give him supreme command over the entire military. The Empire is full of rival power centers. Tarkin has enormous political authority. Vader answers directly to the Emperor. The Death Star is a project with years of institutional momentum behind it. Thrawn cannot simply walk onto the station and overrule everyone because he is clever. But Palpatine now has an additional strategic asset he did not have in canon, and the rebel threat is exactly the kind of problem Thrawn understands. Imagine the months before Scarif and Yavin. Rebel activity is increasing. Mon Mothma has publicly broken with the Empire. Cells are trying to unify. Intelligence networks are searching for information about a secret superweapon. In canon, the Alliance reaches this stage after years of painful coordination. Ahsoka had already disappeared from public rebel operations after Malachor, so she is not personally planning the theft of the Death Star plans. That means her death 20 years earlier does not directly erase Jyn Erso, Cassian Andor, Rogue One, Leia Organa, or the pilots who eventually attack the station. But the organization those people belong to may be weaker. The Rebel Alliance is built by many hands. Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, Hera Syndulla, Leia Organa, military leaders, spies, smugglers, local resistance movements, and ordinary defectors all contribute. Ahsoka is one significant part of that history, not the sole cause. If she dies, an alliance can still form. The question is whether it forms with the same reach, the same surviving personnel, and the same confidence. The loss of the Ghost Crew would be especially damaging here. Hera becomes one of the rebellion's major military leaders. Chopper is involved in operations far beyond Lothal. Sabine's history intersects with Mandalorian resistance and Imperial weapons development. Zeb helps carry the fight forward. Ezra's broadcast and the liberation of Lothal become examples that Imperial occupation can actually be broken. Kanan's sacrifice saves leaders who continue fighting. These are not isolated adventures. They feed personnel, experience, and morale into the larger struggle. If Vader kills Kanan and Ezra early, Hera may still survive and continue fighting, but the Ghost Crew has suffered a catastrophic fracture. If Thrawn crushes Lothal, Hera might be captured or killed as well. If Phoenix Squadron is destroyed more completely in the period when Vader attacks it, the rebellion loses pilots and ships it cannot easily replace. Each loss reduces the pool of people available when Mon Mothma finally calls the separate cells together. Thrawn can then attack that process from the Imperial side. His greatest value is not simply winning fleet battles. It is recognizing that the rebellion needs relationships. He would look for the financial links connecting sympathetic senators to insurgent groups. He would study which worlds provide fuel and repair facilities. He would identify which attacks are designed to steal resources rather than merely inflict damage. Instead of chasing every rebel ship, he could work backward toward the infrastructure that allows those ships to keep appearing. That creates a very different strategic environment for Bail Organa. Bail already has to operate under the eyes of the Imperial Senate and security apparatus. Without Ahsoka, he has one fewer trusted operative capable of handling highly sensitive missions. With Thrawn still present, any pattern in Alderaan's covert support becomes more dangerous. The Empire may not possess enough evidence to openly accuse Bail years before the Death Star is ready, but Thrawn does not need a public trial to make life difficult. Cargo can be inspected, couriers can disappear, suspected intermediaries can be watched, friendly worlds can be pressured. Leia Organa still grows up. She is still raised by Bail and Breha. she can still become a senator and rebel agent. Nothing about Ahsoka's death changes her parentage or the decision to hide the Skywalker twins. Obi-Wan and Yoda are already responsible for that in the immediate aftermath of Revenge of the Sith, and Ahsoka is absent from those events in canon. Luke therefore still grows up on Tatooine unless some other ripple reaches him much later. That point is crucial. This timeline does not erase Luke Skywalker. It makes the road that brings Luke into contact with an organized alliance much more fragile. The Death Star plans are the clearest test. Galen Erso still designs the fatal vulnerability in the reactor system, because his story begins within the Imperial weapons program, not Ahsoka's rebellion. Bodhi Rook can still defect. Jyn Erso can still be pulled into the mission. Cassian Andor can still serve as an intelligence officer if the rebellion survives strongly enough to employ people like him. Saw Gerrera can still lead his extremist partisans because his resistance predates Ahsoka's fulcrum role and follows its own path. But Thrawn's presence changes the odds around Scarif dramatically. The Imperial security failure at Scarif is not just that rebels reach the Archive. It is that a rebel fleet arrives, fights through the orbital defenses, receives the transmitted plans, and manages to move them into Leia's hands despite Vader's pursuit. A strategist who has spent years mapping rebel habits might anticipate the possibility that an apparent small infiltration is connected to a larger fleet action. He might reinforce Archive security, place additional interdiction forces along likely escape routes, or recognize the significance of rebel units mobilizing without formal authorization. Again, Thrawn is not omniscient. Rogue One succeeds because individuals repeatedly make choices outside normal command structures. That kind of improvisation can defeat prediction, but adding Thrawn to the Imperial side while subtracting experienced rebels from the Alliance shifts the balance heavily. Suppose the plans are still stolen. Leia still races away aboard the Tantive I-4, Vader still captures the ship above Tatooine. R2-D2 and C-3PO still escape with the plans. Luke still finds Obi-Wan, the Millennium Falcon still carries them toward Alderaan. Even here, Ahsoka's death may seem irrelevant. That is the beauty of this what-if. The original trilogy can begin looking almost normal even after 20 years of altered history, until the missing pieces become visible at the decisive battle. Alderaan is still a likely target for the Death Star. If Bail has spent years supporting Resistance, Tarkin still has reason to use Leia's homeworld as an example. In fact, a weaker rebellion could make the destruction even more politically effective. There are fewer organized forces capable of responding. Bail dies regardless, removing one of the last major architects of Resistance. Leia loses her family and world. The Falcon escapes the station with the plans. Then the rebels reach Yavin 4, assuming Yavin 4 is still their base. This is another detail we should not treat as inevitable. A different intelligence history could lead the Alliance to choose another headquarters. The base at Yavin might be discovered earlier. The Massassi Temple could still be used, but Thrawn might identify it before the Death Star crisis. For the sake of tracing the recognizable version of events, however, let us assume enough of canon survives that the Alliance is gathered there when Leia returns with the plans. The engineers analyze the schematics and discover the reactor vulnerability. Luke volunteers to fly. Big Starklighter is there if his path remains unchanged. Red and Gold squadrons prepare for what everyone understands is essentially a suicide mission. The question is whether the attack is allowed to unfold the way it does in canon. Thrawn would immediately recognize two things about the Death Star. First, it is an extraordinary weapon of terror. Second, any weapon that encourages its commanders to believe they no longer need conventional caution creates strategic blindness. Thrawn is not sentimental about Imperial doctrine. If presented with evidence of a structural vulnerability, he would not dismiss it because the station is supposedly invulnerable. He would investigate. That does not mean he knows about the exhaust port before the rebels do. Galen Erso hid the flaw carefully, and even the Alliance needs the full plans to identify it. But once the stolen schematics are known to be in rebel hands, Thrawn would assume the enemy has learned something important. The theft itself is evidence. Rebels do not sacrifice a fleet at Scarif for useless data. If Thrawn is anywhere near the Yavin operation, he would advocate layered defenses. More fighters launched earlier, wider patrol patterns, interdictor cruisers positioned to prevent evacuation, reconnaissance beyond the immediate Death Star perimeter. Attacks on the rebel base coordinated with the station, rather than simply waiting for the super laser to enter range. None of these ideas requires Thrawn to understand the Force or predict Luke's exact shot. They only require him to respect the opponent. Canon Tarkin's fatal mistake is confidence. Even when warned that there may be a danger, he refuses to evacuate because he does not believe the rebel attack can threaten the station. Thrawn is almost the opposite personality. He wins by assuming that apparently weak enemies may have identified a way to turn his strengths against him. If he sees rebel starfighters entering a trench and repeatedly targeting a specific exhaust port, he does not need a complete engineering report to understand that the target matters. Vader is already smart enough to respond tactically. In canon, he leads TIE fighters into the trench and nearly stops the attack. He kills or drives off multiple pilots and has Luke in his sights before Han Solo returns. Now add a more focused, more emotionally isolated Vader to a defensive plan shaped by Thrawn. Luke's margin for survival becomes microscopic. Ahsoka's death does not make Vader stronger in the Force, but it may make him less distracted by remnants of his former identity. He still has Obi-Wan to confront on the Death Star, and Obi-Wan's death still affects him. He still senses something unusual about the pilot attacking the station, but he has spent the Imperial era without discovering Ahsoka alive, without dueling her on Malachor, and without that direct reminder that Anakin's past can return. His entire career has been a straighter line of Imperial violence. During the trench run, that could matter only by seconds. Vader fires sooner. He is less surprised by the intensity of the Force around Luke. Thrawn assigns additional fighters to cover Vader's formation. Han's return is detected earlier. An interdictor or reserve squadron prevents the Millennium Falcon from approaching unnoticed. Any one of those changes can stop the proton torpedoes from reaching the exhaust port. And if Luke misses, the first Death Star survives. The consequences of that single failure are almost impossible to overstate. In canon, the Battle of Yavin is the moment the Empire discovers that terror is not the same thing as invulnerability. The Death Star has destroyed Alderaan and demonstrated enough power to frighten entire systems into submission, but then a tiny rebel force destroys it. That victory gives the Alliance something more valuable than ships: proof. The Empire can be hurt. The Emperor's greatest weapon can burn. A farm boy can make an impossible shot and survive. Every world considering resistance suddenly has a reason to believe resistance is not suicide. If the Death Star destroys the rebel base instead, the message is reversed. Alderaan is gone. Yavin is gone. The Organized Alliance has lost a huge concentration of pilots, commanders, technicians, and political leadership in a matter of hours. Mon Mothma may be on the base depending on the exact version of events. If she is, the political heart of the rebellion dies with it. Even if she is elsewhere, the military disaster is staggering. The station that was supposed to contain a hidden weakness has just survived the one attack designed to exploit it. The Emperor would immediately turn the victory into propaganda. The so-called Rebel Alliance, he would announce, has been eliminated. The destruction of Alderaan would be described as the cost of treason. The destruction of Yavin would prove that no secret base is beyond Imperial reach. Systems considering open revolt would watch what happened to two worlds associated with rebellion and reconsider. Thrawn would understand that this is the moment to prevent survivors from reorganizing. A conventional Imperial commander might celebrate and disperse forces back to routine duties. Thrawn would ask where the escapees are going. He would trace fuel purchases, medical shipments, encrypted traffic, and sudden movements of sympathetic senators. He would assume that surviving cells will attempt to preserve command continuity. Then he would target those links before another alliance can emerge. This is where the absence of Ahsoka's earlier work becomes relevant again. A resilient insurgency survives decapitation by having multiple independent networks capable of reconnecting. The Canon Rebellion develops that kind of depth over years. If those networks are already thinner in this timeline, Yavin is more than a battlefield defeat. It becomes a systemic collapse. Saw Gerrera is already dead by this point if the events on Jedha unfold similarly. Bail Organa is dead on Alderaan. If Mon Mothma dies or is isolated, Leia may become one of the most important surviving political figures almost immediately. Hera, if she survived Thrawn's earlier campaign, could become equally important militarily. But there is no guarantee either woman has enough ships or personnel to rebuild a galaxy-wide movement while the Death Star remains operational. The Empire also no longer needs to hide the station. Once the Senate has been dissolved and Alderaan destroyed, fear is the governing principle. A surviving Death Star can move from system to system as an instrument of coercion. It does not have to destroy every rebellious planet. The threat is enough. Governors can point to Alderaan and Yavin and demand surrender. Local uprisings that once hoped an alliance fleet might arrive have to assume that any large concentration of resistance could attract a superlaser. Could Luke still escape Yavin? Possibly. The exact battle could fail without killing every pilot. Han and Chewbacca might pull him out after the torpedoes miss. Leia might evacuate aboard another ship before the station fires. Star Wars is full of survivors, but even a surviving Luke enters a far darker story. Obi-Wan is already dead. Yoda remains hidden on Dagobah, and Luke does not yet know where to find him. The alliance that gave him a purpose has been shattered. Vader now has reason to investigate the Force-sensitive pilot who came close to destroying the Death Star. Thrawn would be interested too. He does not need to sense the Force to recognize unusual behavior. A novice pilot with minimal formal training has just survived a trench filled with elite fighters, evaded Vader, and attempted the precise attack the rebels believed could destroy the station. If Imperial records connect Luke Skywalker to Tatooine, the name itself becomes explosive once Vader learns it. In canon, Vader discovers Luke's identity after Yavin and becomes obsessed with finding him. That obsession eventually drives a wedge between Vader's goals and the Emperor's. Vader wants Luke as an ally and son. Palpatine ultimately wants Luke as a possible replacement apprentice or wants him destroyed. This dynamic still has the potential to reopen Anakin's humanity even in our timeline. Ahsoka's death cannot erase the fact that Luke is his child, but the circumstances are worse. Canon Luke approaches the Vader conflict after becoming a hero of the rebellion. He has friends, a cause, growing confidence, and eventually the guidance of Yoda. A Luke fleeing the ruins of Yavin is more isolated. If Vader captures him early, before he knows the truth about his father, and before he has completed any meaningful Jedi training, the emotional balance of their relationship changes dramatically. Vader might still hesitate to kill him once he learns who he is. That part of Anakin is not dependent on Ahsoka, yet a more deeply entrenched Vader may express that attachment almost entirely through possession. Instead of "join me and we can destroy the Emperor," after years of searching, he could take Luke directly into Imperial custody and attempt to reshape him before Luke has developed the moral foundation that lets him refuse. Palpatine would immediately recognize both opportunity and danger. If Luke dies at Yavin, however, the traditional path to Vader's redemption becomes almost impossible. Leia still exists, but Vader does not know she is his daughter, and their canon interactions give him no reason to discover it until much later. Obi-Wan and Yoda are aging. The Jedi tradition survives in fragments, but the person who ultimately refuses to give up on Anakin is gone. This is the deepest reason the prompt's idea of a fully corrupted Vader is plausible, though it needs one qualification. Ahsoka's survival was not the only thing keeping Anakin alive inside Vader. Padme's memory remains. Obi-Wan remains. Luke and Leia remain. Vader's conflict is part of him whether Ahsoka lives or dies, but killing Ahsoka during Order 66 removes one of the very few opportunities for that conflict to be confronted before Luke. If Luke then dies because the rebellion reaches Yavin weaker and Thrawn remains in command, the sequence of second chances is exhausted one by one. Palpatine benefits enormously. His original victory in Revenge of the Sith is already extraordinary. The Jedi are nearly exterminated. The Republic voluntarily becomes an empire. The Separatist leadership is murdered, and his new apprentice survives. Yet Sidious's future defeat grows from things he fails to eliminate. Bail Organa survives and raises Leia. Obi-Wan and Yoda survive. Ahsoka survives. Rex survives. Maul survives. The twins survive. Scattered rebel cells survive. His victory is overwhelming but not complete. Our divergence makes it more complete without changing Palpatine's plan at all. Ahsoka's death removes herself and indirectly threatens Rex. The lack of Ahsoka's escape keeps Maul in custody. Vader loses a future confrontation with his past. Rebel cells lose an important intelligence operative. The Ghost Crew has fewer allies. Ezra's path becomes more fragile. Thrawn has a better chance of remaining in the galaxy. By the time the Death Star appears, the Empire is facing an opposition that has lost several of the accidents and relationships that canon allowed to accumulate against it. And Star Wars often turns on exactly those accumulations. Palpatine believes history can be engineered from the top. He manipulates senates, armies, and wars. The heroes repeatedly defeat that kind of control through relationships he considers irrelevant. A droid carries plans. A smuggler returns at the last second. An apprentice refuses to abandon a friend. A clone remembers enough of himself to say the name Fives. A boy befriends creatures an admiral sees as animals. A father chooses his son over his master. Ahsoka's survival aboard the Tribunal belongs in that same category. It is not a grand military victory. The Republic has already fallen. She does not stop Order 66. She does not save the Jedi Temple. She does not prevent Anakin from becoming Vader. She barely saves herself and one clone captain. Yet those two survivors continue carrying relationships forward into an era designed to erase them. Without that survival, the Empire becomes more efficient, precisely because fewer people remain to remember what existed before it. Rex is perhaps the clearest symbol of that memory. In canon, his existence contradicts Imperial history. He knows the Jedi were not traitors. He knows the clones did not freely choose the Purge. He remembers Anakin as a general rather than a Sith Lord. He remembers Ahsoka as a commander rather than an enemy of the state. When he eventually fights beside rebels, he physically carries the Clone Wars into the Galactic Civil War. A Rex who remains Imperial turns that memory inside out. He becomes evidence of how completely the Empire can absorb the Republic. The same man who once argued for clone individuality can be used to train troops in standardized obedience. The same captain who fought for worlds under the banner of democracy can pacify them under an emperor. The same friend who trusted Ahsoka can be made responsible for her death. There is a point at which Rex's conscience may still break through. It would be dramatically consistent with him to question what the Empire becomes. He might see stormtroopers replacing clones and understand that his brothers were always disposable. He might discover Kamino's destruction or learn more about the chips. He might encounter a surviving Jedi who refuses to kill him and suddenly remember Ahsoka lowering her blades years earlier. If that happens, Rex could desert. The 392nd would face a similar identity crisis. In canon, almost the entire group dies without being freed from the chips. Their helmets become grave markers. In our timeline, they survive the Tribunal, which sounds merciful until we ask what survival means. These soldiers enter an empire that increasingly strips clone units of the identity they developed during the war. The Ahsoka markings on their helmets are politically awkward at best. An Imperial quartermaster eventually orders the paint removed. The orange faces disappear beneath standardized white. Some troopers might remember why the markings were there. Some might feel discomfort around the story of Ahsoka's execution. Others might accept the official explanation completely. Over time, accelerated aging scatters them into retirement, training posts, or forgotten garrisons. A unit created as a tribute to Ahsoka becomes one more institution the Empire erases. Mandalore is affected as well. Ahsoka's death occurs after Maul has been captured, and Bo-Katan's forces have won control of the capital with Republic assistance. The occupation force remains on Mandalore at the exact moment the Republic becomes the Empire. In canon, Ahsoka and Rex are gone, Maul escapes, and Imperial rule eventually hardens over the planet through figures like Gar Saxon. Bo-Katan's refusal to submit creates further conflict. In this timeline, the clone detachment associated with the siege has no surviving Ahsoka to complicate its orders. Imperial authorities can transition from liberation to occupation immediately. Maul is still a prisoner. Bo-Katan has lost the powerful outsider whose intervention helped remove him. Rex is loyal to the new regime. If Palpatine wants Mandalore secured, the troops already on the planet can receive that instruction without interruption. Bo-Katan will resist. Nothing about Ahsoka's death makes her accept Imperial rule. But her position is worse. She cannot later point to Ahsoka as an ally who understood what happened during the siege. She may not know the truth of Order 66 at all. From her perspective, the Republic forces that helped defeat Maul simply become Imperial occupiers in the space of a day. That confirms every Mandalorian fear about outside intervention. The absence of Maul after the Tribunal also changes the criminal underworld. He no longer spends the Imperial era directing syndicates from the shadows. Crimson Dawn may still rise through leaders like Dryden Voss, but without Maul's direct control, its relationship to the Empire could be less confrontational or simply different. That removes another unpredictable network capable of moving weapons, information, and fugitives beyond Imperial systems. For ordinary citizens, none of these changes are immediately visible. That is what makes the timeline unsettling. The same Emperor gives the same speech. The same clone troopers stand in the same streets. The same Star Destroyers patrol the same systems. Ahsoka Tano is not famous enough across the entire galaxy for her death to feel like a historic event. There are no mass demonstrations because she failed to escape one cruiser. History changes quietly. One rebel courier never receives a fulcrum transmission. One Imperial convoy is not ambushed because the intelligence arrived too late. One pilot who would have joined Phoenix Squadron stays trapped on an occupied world. One clone veteran never returns to battle. One Jedi apprentice faces Vader without an ally. One Grand Admiral remains at his post because the boy who would have summoned the Purgle never reaches that moment. One trench run meets a defense organized by people who take the threat seriously. By the time anyone could see the pattern, there may be no rebellion strong enough to name it, so the Empire may win at Yavin and still fail eventually. And that brings us back to Ahsoka on the bridge of the Tribunal. Because if we strip away all the later titles, all the mythology surrounding Fulcrum, all the battles and rebels, and all the questions about what Ahsoka becomes after the original trilogy, the decisive act is remarkably small. She survives long enough to hear Rex say one name, Fives. She trusts that the clone captain she knows is still somewhere inside the man trying to kill her. She investigates instead of treating him as an enemy. She removes the chip. Then, even while the 332nd is firing at her, she refuses to slaughter them simply because killing them would make escape easier. That choice preserves Rex as a person, and Rex, once preserved, becomes capable of preserving other things. He carries the truth of the clone army into the future. He helps brothers who want out. He eventually joins rebels who have never seen the Republic at its best and can tell them what the war actually felt like. His presence gives Kanan a chance to discover that the clones who murdered the Jedi were not all willing participants. He becomes living evidence that programming does not define the entirety of a person. That theme mirrors Vader in a way that becomes obvious only when the two stories are placed beside each other. Rex is physically compelled to betray someone he loves, and is freed when another person refuses to give up on the man beneath the programming. Vader chooses his betrayal freely, then spends decades convincing himself that Anakin no longer exists, until his son refuses to give up on the man beneath the armor. The mechanisms are different, and Vader bears moral responsibility in a way Rex does not, but both stories ask whether identity can survive beneath a system built to overwrite it. Ahsoka stands between those stories. She is the person who saves Rex, and later the person who looks at Vader and still sees Anakin. She cannot save Anakin herself. That matters. Her compassion has limits because Vader continues choosing violence. On Malachor, she is willing to remain with him, but she cannot make him return. Luke eventually succeeds because his relationship to Anakin is different, and because Vader finally makes the choice himself. If Ahsoka dies during Order 66, the galaxy loses that bridge between the two questions. Rex is not rescued at the moment he needs it. Vader is not confronted by his former apprentice at the moment he believes that past is buried. Ezra does not meet the same Ahsoka who survived both the Jedi Order and Vader. The story loses a person whose entire life demonstrates that surviving an institution does not require becoming what that institution expected. That is why calling Ahsoka an invisible linchpin is more accurate than calling her the sole architect of victory. A linchpin does not power the entire machine. It holds pieces together that are already moving. Bail Organa has courage without Ahsoka. Hera has leadership without Ahsoka. Kanan has the Force without Ahsoka. Ezra has compassion without Ahsoka. Rex has a conscience beneath his inhibitor chip without Ahsoka. Luke has the potential to redeem his father without ever meeting Ahsoka. What Ahsoka repeatedly does is keep enough of these pieces connected that their individual strengths can matter at the same time. Her death aboard the Tribunal separates them. Bail still resists, but he must build his intelligence network with one fewer uniquely capable agent. Hera still fights, but the path between her local cell and older veterans becomes thinner. Kanan still trains Ezra, but they face the Imperial Jedi hunters with fewer allies who understand what the Sith truly are. Rex may eventually rediscover his conscience, but he does so after being used to murder Ahsoka and potentially years of serving the Empire. Maul, never released, is likely removed from the board entirely. Ezra may still become a remarkable Jedi, but the probability that he survives every Imperial escalation falls. If Ezra falls, Thrawn stays. If Thrawn stays, the Empire becomes far harder to surprise. If the Alliance arrives at Yavin weaker, and the Empire arrives more prepared, Luke's impossible victory becomes even more impossible. That is not a straight mathematical equation. Star Wars history is too chaotic for that. Another rebel could replace a dead commander. Another spy could become Fulcrum. Another strategist could remove Thrawn. Another Force-sensitive hero could arise. Even the Force itself seems to produce unexpected answers when darkness becomes overwhelming. But alternate history is about pressure, and every pressure in this scenario points in the same direction. The Empire gains time. The Rebellion loses connections. Vader loses reminders of Anakin. The clones lose one of the people most determined to see them as victims rather than machines. Vader cannot react as Anakin. To do so would expose weakness and identity. He can only listen. If Palpatine arranged the encounter deliberately, it becomes another act of psychological torture. Vader is forced to hear Ahsoka reduced to a line in a report from the friend who killed her under orders neither of them truly chose. Rex is forced to serve a master he does not realize is his former general. Two survivors of Anakin Skywalker stand in front of each other, and the Empire prevents either one from speaking his name. Perhaps Vader dismisses him coldly. Perhaps he later destroys something in private. Perhaps he develops a strange reluctance to send Rex on suicidal missions, an instinct he refuses to explain. That could become the seed of Rex eventually discovering the truth. A gesture, a tactical phrase, an impossible familiarity with an old battle, something about Vader that reminds him of General Skywalker. If Rex learns who Vader is, the revelation could finally shatter his loyalty. Ahsoka was killed by the clones. Anakin became the Emperor's apprentice. The Jedi Purge was not a defensive action, but a manufactured extermination. Everything Fives warned about was real. Rex might finally understand the full shape of the trap, but imagine the guilt attached to that understanding. He would realize that Ahsoka's last conscious moments were spent facing him, not Vader. Anakin fell and Rex fired the shots. Sidious manipulated them both from the same room on Coruscant without ever touching a blaster. For Rex, rebellion could become less about restoring the Republic and more about refusing to let Ahsoka's death be the final word on who he is. That late Rex rebellion is one of the few hopeful branches in this scenario. He might desert with other clones. He might leak Imperial information to Bail's network. He might save a Jedi he was ordered to hunt. He might eventually hear the name Fulcrum used by another agent and never know that in another life, Ahsoka would have carried it. The rebellion could still gain Captain Rex, just years later, and covered in far deeper scars. Likewise, the Ghost Crew might still survive without Ahsoka through sheer ingenuity. Hera has escaped impossible situations before. Kanan's caution as a survivor of Order 66 could keep them away from Vader. Ezra's connection to Lothal could still lead him toward the Purrgil. Thrawn could still underestimate something spiritual that does not fit into his strategic models. The Rebel Alliance could still steal the Death Star plans. Luke could still trust the Force. Those possibilities are important because they reveal what Ahsoka actually changes. Her survival does not create hope from nothing. Hope exists everywhere in Star Wars. Her survival keeps hope from having to start over every time the Empire cuts one connection. Without her, victories become more isolated. Hera may win a battle without receiving the intelligence needed for the next one. Rex may rediscover his conscience without knowing where the rebels are. Ezra may find the Force without meeting the network that can protect his family. Luke may appear at the end of a 20-year struggle, whose surviving leaders are too scattered to put him in an X-wing above Yavin. Palpatine's greatest advantage has always been isolation. He isolates Anakin from the Jedi Council. He isolates the Jedi from public trust. He isolates systems through fear. He turns political problems into separate emergencies so that no one recognizes the same hand creating all of them. The rebellion defeats that method by connecting people who should have remained isolated from one another. Ahsoka is exceptionally good at making those connections because she herself belongs nowhere completely. She leaves the Jedi but does not abandon the light. She commands clones but refuses to see them as property. She works with senators but is not a politician. She enters the rebellion but operates from the shadows. She understands Anakin but ultimately refuses to follow him into darkness. She can stand between eras because no single institution owns her identity. Killing her during Order 66 lets Palpatine's strategy succeed on a symbolic level as well as a military one. The Jedi Purge is supposed to eliminate not only the Order, but the relationships the Order created. Masters die away from apprentices. Clones kill generals. Survivors hide their names. Archives are destroyed. Children grow up believing Jedi were traitors or myths. Ahsoka surviving undermines that erasure because she carries an enormous amount of living history forward. She remembers Plo Koon finding her. She remembers Yoda and Obi-Wan. She remembers Anakin before Vader. She remembers Rex before Order 66. She remembers the Jedi Order's virtues and its failures. She remembers why she left. When she later encounters new rebels and young Force users, all of that history enters the room with her. A blaster bolt on the Tribunal destroys that archive. The Empire then controls more of the story. Rex may remember, but his memories are trapped inside Imperial service. Obi-Wan remembers, but he is hidden on Tatooine. Yoda remembers, but he is isolated on Dagobah. Bail remembers parts of the truth, but he must operate as a senator under surveillance. The surviving witnesses are separated from each other exactly as Sidious wants. That makes the rise of the rebellion slower. Not impossible, but slower. And timing matters because the Empire is not static. Every year Palpatine remains unchallenged, gives him more Star Destroyers, more academies, more intelligence infrastructure, and more citizens who have never known another government. Children born after Order 66 grow up under Imperial education. Worlds adapt economically to Imperial control. Fear becomes normal. Ahsoka's fulcrum work in canon occurs during this vulnerable middle period, before the Rebel Alliance publicly declares itself, but after local resistance has begun appearing everywhere. She helps make sure separate sparks can recognize that other sparks exist. If that work is less effective, the Empire gets more years to extinguish them individually. By the time Mon Mothma openly calls for unity, some of the cells that answered in canon may already be gone. Phoenix Squadron could be one of them. The Lothal Rebels could be another. Mandalorian resistance may be more isolated. Clone veterans may never re-enter the fight. The Alliance forms smaller, later, and under greater pressure. Then Thrawn's survival compounds the delay. The reason his removal from Lothal matters so much is not that he single-handedly commands every Imperial operation. It is that the Empire loses one of the few senior officers consistently willing to study rebels as intelligent opponents. At Yavin, arrogance helps kill the Death Star. At Endor, arrogance helps lure the Imperial fleet into a battle Palpatine believes is already decided. Thrawn represents a different Imperial instinct. Understand first, then strike. If Ezra never removes him, that instinct remains available to the regime during its most important crises. Would Thrawn have prevented Palpatine's eventual downfall forever? Probably not. His relationship to the Empire is pragmatic, and his priorities include threats beyond the political concerns of ordinary Imperial officers. He is not ideologically devoted to every aspect of Palpatine's rule. Over enough years, conflicts could emerge, but from the perspective of a young rebel alliance, it hardly matters whether Thrawn and Sidious might disagree someday. The immediate problem is surviving long enough for that someday to arrive. The same is true of Vader. His inner conflict still exists, but an inner conflict has no galactic value unless something reaches it. Ahsoka reaches it and fails. Luke reaches it and eventually succeeds. Remove Ahsoka and then increase the odds that Luke dies before he can try. and Vader's buried humanity becomes irrelevant to everyone except Vader. He remains the Emperor's weapon. He hunts Jedi. He destroys rebel cells. He stands beside the Death Star rather than dying to save his son. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker becomes complete, not because there was never good left in him, but because everyone capable of calling that good back to the surface died before the moment he was willing to answer. That is perhaps the darkest version of this timeline. Not a galaxy where hope never existed, but a galaxy where hope repeatedly arrives one person too late. Ahsoka dies before she can save Rex. Rex wakes up too late to save Ahsoka. A rebel network forms too late to protect one of its cells. Ezra understands his purpose too late to remove Thrawn. Luke reaches Yavin too late to exploit the Death Star's weakness. Vader recognizes his son too late to undo the Empire he helped preserve. And all of it begins with a clone captain pulling a trigger he desperately tried not to pull. So if Order 66 successfully killed Ahsoka Tano, the immediate result would be tragic but contained. Ahsoka dies, Rex remains under the influence of his inhibitor chip, the 302nd survives to become part of the new Imperial military, and Maul remains imprisoned because Ahsoka never releases him to destroy the Tribunal. But the long-term result is a galaxy in which several of Palpatine's most dangerous loose ends are tied off at once. Maul is probably delivered into Imperial custody and eventually eliminated unless he manages another extraordinary escape. Rex may serve the Empire through the early purge and only rediscover his conscience after years of damage. Ahsoka never becomes one of Bail Organa's most capable intelligence agents. The Ghost Crew loses a crucial ally and the route that brings Rex back into the fight. Kanan and Ezra face Vader and the Inquisitors with a much smaller safety margin. Ezra's path to the liberation of Lothal becomes far less likely. If Ezra does not survive to summon the Purrgil, Thrawn remains in the Imperial military. And if Thrawn is still available when the Death Star plans are stolen, the Empire has a much better chance of recognizing that the tiny rebel attack over Yavin is not an act of desperation, but a real attempt to exploit a hidden weakness. The first Death Star surviving Yavin is not guaranteed. Luke Skywalker is still Luke Skywalker, and the Force remains the greatest variable in any Star Wars timeline. But the odds move sharply against him. His rebellion is weaker. Vader is colder. Thrawn may be present. Imperial defenses are more likely to take the threat seriously. Han Solo has to return at exactly the right moment, Luke has to survive the trench, and the station has to remain arrogant enough to give him the chance. Remove even one of those conditions, and Yavin becomes the graveyard of the Rebel Alliance rather than the beginning of its legend. That is why Ahsoka's survival during Order 66 matters so much. She was never merely the former Padawan who happened to escape. She became one of the connective figures between the Clone Wars and the Age of Rebellion. Through Rex, Bail, Hera, Kanan, Ezra, and eventually her confrontation with Vader, she carried people and memories across a historical break Palpatine intended to make absolute. The irony is that Ahsoka did not survive because she was following some grand plan to save the galaxy. She survived because Rex resisted for a few seconds, because she listened, because Fives had died trying to expose the truth, because a group of droids helped her, and because she refused to abandon someone she cared about. The future of the galaxy was protected by a chain of choices that none of the people involved could fully understand at the time. In this alternate timeline, that chain breaks on the bridge of the Tribunal. Ahsoka falls, Rex lowers his smoking pistols. The clones report that their target has been eliminated. Maul remains sealed in his prison. The cruiser continues through hyperspace toward a republic that no longer exists. And somewhere far away, Darth Vader takes his first steps into an Imperial future with one fewer person left alive who remembers the man he used to be. For Palpatine, it would look like one more successful execution under Order 66. In reality, it might be the quietest and most important victory the Empire ever received. Thanks for watching. If there are any other Clone Wars what-if scenarios, characters, or alternate storylines you want us to explore, leave your ideas in the comments below. And until the next video, may the Force be with you.